In 1986, a man of just 20 years old walked into the woods of his own volition and disappeared for nearly 30 years. And when he was found, his story, which he considered unremarkable, captivated millions. Today, I'm going to tell you this story, but quickly beforehand, I wanted to welcome you. I'm T, and this is my channel, T Storytime, where we discuss urban legends, mythology, and history. If you like this sort of content, I welcome you to subscribe to my channel, and if you'd like others to know that this channel exists, I'd appreciate a like and even a comment. Even if you just want to say hi, I'd love to hear from you. With that, let's get into today's story. Christopher Thomas Knight was born on December 7th, 1965 in Maine. By all accounts, Knight was a shy individual, and not just normal shy, like shy to the point of finding interacting with others intimidating. Despite this, by all accounts, Knight was a brilliant individual and had no trouble graduating from Lawrence High School in Fairfield, Maine in 1984. And after this, he went on to study electronics at Sylvania Technical School, and afterwards he took a job installing alarms into homes in Waltham, Massachusetts, a small town that's essentially a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. Knight's family was fine too. By his own admission, he had good parents and a good, if stoic, relationship with them. His family was quite eccentric though, and at night when most families would be gathered around a TV, his family would read poetry and Shakespeare. His family also fixed their own automobiles, knew plumbing, and for some reason studied thermodynamics together. By one account, they even built a greenhouse, burying hundreds of gallons of water underneath it. In short, they did this because at night, water molecules release their heat, enabling them to grow their own food all winter in Maine without electricity heating the greenhouse. As you can tell, they were different, and not necessarily in a bad way. Clearly, despite not being so financially well off, the family was extremely intelligent and resourceful. They were also, by some neighbors' accounts, a bit reclusive. The neighbor reported that after about 14 years of living near Knight's family, they'd barely even exchanged words. Now, at this point, this story sounds fairly mundane. He was just a smart guy from a unique family, but that all changed when Knight, at the age of 20 in 1986, decided to go for a drive back up to Maine near his hometown. Around the point where his car was nearly out of gas, he stopped his car by a trail, threw his keys on the dashboard, and took a walk into the woods that, as far as he was concerned, was meant to last for the rest of his life. Now, from what I can tell, leaving society behind didn't mean a whole lot to Knight. He didn't even keep track of the date in later accounts when he simply recalled that he left his life behind around the time that the Chernobyl reactor accident occurred in 1986. Personally, I like to think that maybe he remembered this incident because the nuclear accident was his final sign to get out of Dodge, so to speak. Additionally, while he was clearly well equipped for the task at hand in terms of his skill set, it didn't seem like he took time to prepare for the venture, as his accounts suggest that right after he left into the woods, he sort of moved around without a plan, at first at least, bouncing from one place to another until he found his iconic site where he stayed for the long haul. And speaking of Knight's camp, it's actually an interesting story in and of itself. It was located on private property, and it was actually fairly close to hundreds of cabins, towns, and dirt roads, and by one account, a 3-minute or about 600-meter walk to the nearest residence. I mention this because when you think of this case, you often think that this man didn't see other humans for nearly 3 decades, so he must have been really deep in the woods, but that's clearly not the case, and in actuality, he was in the middle of society, albeit a more rural or suburban one. And this location begs the question, how did Knight not get caught? Well, this is partially attributable to the fact that this part of the forest he was in was extremely thick, filled with boulders, and disorienting. According to one article about this case, the journalist even thought it'd be too difficult for deer to get back to his campsite, and while attempting to get to the site, he cut his hands and ripped up his hiking shoes. The campsite itself has been described as, I quote, a magical room in the middle of the forest, hidden by a Stonehenge of boulders with a perfectly flat floor. This flat floor wasn't natural though. He'd actually bound together National Geographic magazines and buried them under the soil to flatten out the ground. Also helping Knight's case was the fact that he took great care not to be spotted and not to stand out. Knight avoided building fires with wood and instead stole propane to melt snow to drink and to bathe and to cook, so therefore there was never any dark smoke that indicated his location. He also made sure to steal supplies, to keep his hair cut, and to keep himself clean-shaven, making him look approximately normal and not necessarily standing out in the few instances when he was spotted. When he did leave camp to burgle supplies, he'd do it in the middle of the night too, often walking or canoeing to other campsites in the summer, so he didn't have to contend with the elements, and more importantly, so he didn't have to risk leaving footsteps in the snow leading back to his camp. Also, when he burgled propane, he'd transport the propane cylinders back to his camp via a canoe often that he borrowed from camps nearby, and then he'd paddle the canoes back to camp before dawn and conceal these canoes when he returned by putting pine needles all over them to make it look like nobody had used the canoe in some time. To boot, his parents never reported him missing. Not that they didn't worry about him, they just had the feeling that if he ran off, and they weren't going to stop him. To put it succinctly, Knight had a bit of a perfect storm. He knew how to stay unseen, and nobody was ever looking for him in the first place. This perfect storm didn't mean that he was off scot-free though. See, Knight was living in the wilderness of Maine after all, a part of the country that's extremely hostile at times, with winters that are about as rough as they get in the United States. In the dead of winter in Maine, it's not unusual for the low temperature to be around -25 Fahrenheit or about -32 Celsius. To counter this, and to prevent freezing inside of a sleeping bag, Knight would wake up when the temperature was at its coldest, about 2 to 3 a.m., and would walk laps around his campsite while he melted and boiled snow with his propane stove, drinking the hot liquid to keep warm as he paced around to warm up his body. There were times, though, when even this strategy wasn't enough. In one quote, Knight remarked, "When it gets below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when you have religion, and when you pray for warmth." Apparently, there were even some winters where Knight had run out of food and propane, and according to him, these were times that he suffered, I quote, "physical, emotional, and psychological pain." He'd even contemplated ending it all, and by all I mean sometimes himself, but also sometimes his time out in the forest. See, Knight actually at one point, perhaps in the moment when things weren't going well, stole a whistle, although he never ended up using it. He eventually reserved himself to the reality that, unless he was caught, he'd just continue living in the woods forever. Now, the winter, of course, did eventually end every year, and according to Knight, when he heard chickadees singing, or small North American birds singing, he knew each year that he'd made it through the worst of the season, and that happier times were ahead. In these happier times, I like to imagine that Knight's free time was abundant during the day, and I actually enjoyed reading how he spent it. Apparently during this time, Knight would do a number of things, and this is speculation to an extent, but it seems like the majority of his free time was spent reading. According to folks who he burgled, Knight would steal just about anything he could read, from magazines to books to newspapers. Over the 27 years he was in the woods, it was estimated he might have stolen over 1,000 books. He'd also at one point managed to come across radios and headphones. He hid the antenna for the radio in a tree, and he'd listen to conservative talk radio and music. And apparently of all of the music he listened to, he had an affinity for Leonard Skinner the most, even remarking in one interview that people would still be listening to them in 1,000 years. In addition to music, he also found handheld video games while burgling, and while the articles I read didn't go into detail, he'd apparently spent a bit of time playing games like Tetris, Dig Dug, and even Pokemon. Also, I guess one interesting benefit to his seclusion is that over the course of these 27 years, by his account, he never once got sick. According to him, you have to have contact with other people to get sick, and as far as we can tell, he's telling the truth about not seeing anyone. In fact, there were only 3 confirmed accounts and admissions by Knight of him seeing anyone at all. One was in the 1990s when at one point Knight walked by a guy on a trail and said hi. That's it. There was also a break-in in 2012 when Knight slipped into someone's house because there wasn't a car parked there. But turns out people being home and cars being home are not mutually exclusive, so Knight got yelled out of the house. His camp was also discovered by a fisherman in 2013, but lucky for Knight, this fisherman respected Knight's wishes of being left alone and never told on him. Now, as you can tell, things appeared to be going well for Knight. He was able to steal necessities and even some luxuries, and was clearly well equipped for the task of hiding away from society. This didn't mean that his thievery was going unnoticed, though. During Knight's time in the woods, he committed over 40 burglaries a year, over 1,000 in total, and while these break-ins were never destructive, with no broken windows or smashed locks, he was still stealing from people. Now, he was kind about it at least. He'd locked the doors behind him when he left, but this is theft, and it didn't go unnoticed, nor was it appreciated. The community began to catch on that there was someone serially thieving from their community, which according to residents at the time created a general feeling of unease. There were even accounts I found that some elderly individuals were scared to show up to their homes in the spring after the regular post-winter break-ins that kept occurring. Some folks would even leave notes out for the possible Hermit, offering to give him what he needed in lieu of him breaking in if he'd just leave them a note telling them what he needed, but Knight never heeded these notes apparently if he saw them at all. All of this activity led to Knight being referenced as a sort of mythological creature almost, and the North Pond Hermit was the name given to him. Folks didn't entirely agree upon whether he was real, but eventually, after more than 1,000 burglaries, the game warden in the area decided enough was enough and that there had to be something or someone behind this anomaly. The local game warden had followed his case his entire career and apparently sort of took personal offense to the fact that an individual was able to evade him after all these years. Because of this, he commissioned high-tech surveillance equipment, installing it around the area and in commonly burgled spots. Eventually, this high-tech equipment did the trick, sadly ending Knight's 30-year run in the woods. It was a cool night in March of 2013 in Rome, Maine, when Knight broke into one of his most common spots to get food, the Pine Tree Camp, a camp for disabled youth and adults. A motion detector caught Knight setting off his silent alarm and notifying the game warden, who caught Knight in the act at about 1:30 in the morning. Apparently for a minute, the game warden doubted whether Knight was even a thief. Knight was apparently very neat and tidy looking, with clean clothes on and a clean-shaven face. But regardless, the game warden apprehended him and eventually sent him to jail in Augusta, eventually being sentenced to serve 7 months in jail and pay $2,000 in restitution to victims, to get counseling, and to do community service, almost like he was ordered by court to rejoin society in a sense. Now, the reason we know this story at all is that the story of Knight's capture attracted the attention of one author, Michael Finkel, who eventually wrote a book about Knight called The Stranger in the Woods. He had interviewed Knight, and it was in these interviews that we've come to learn basically all of what we know about Knight, the facts that have captivated and inspired so many. In short, through these interviews, we learned that Knight, while a thief, was generally a very sympathetic person. By Knight's own admission, he wasn't proud of his theft, even remarking, "People have a right to be angry," and that he took no pleasure in burgling and wanted these burglaries to be over as quickly as possible. He was also asked about literature and if he kept a journal or considered his similarities to others who had taken a similar walk of life, to which he responded, "I expected to die out there. Who would read my journal? You? I'd rather take it to my grave." Also, as I said, when compared to similar folks from the past, specifically Henry David Thoreau, he seemed displeased. Generally, Knight felt that Henry David Thoreau went out into the wild to show off, and wasn't committed to the life that Knight was, only experimenting living in the wilderness for 2 years. I quote, "Thoreau's mom still did his laundry." When it came to Knight's sentencing for his crimes, even the prosecutor said that he felt a long sentence would have been cruel and he was unlikely to reoffend. It was clear to everyone, and it's probably even clear to us as outside readers, Knight felt guilty about his theft, but theft was a worthwhile price to Knight to pay for his freedom away from a society which he was clearly lukewarm about at best. And this leaves us where we are today, with a fairly uneventful ending to the life of Knight, the North Pond Hermit, and the beginning of Knight, the quiet member of society. Knight eventually got a job with his brothers, working for them in exchange for room and board. I also saw accounts that he involves himself in community service and regularly volunteers and helps out his family where he can. And that's it. Just like that, the North Pond Hermit gave up on his remarkable life in the woods. Admittedly, it's difficult for me to find a proper ending to the story. On one hand, this story reminds me of the happy ending alternative to Into the Wild, where Knight genuinely got all he wanted or needed out of his experiment, and lived as a free man longer than perhaps anyone in the modern USA, experiencing a life that many talk about, but few could ever dream of paying the price for. In a weird way, while Knight didn't pass away or end up in jail though, I can't help but feel bad for him. Like domesticating a proud wild animal, sticking Knight into everyday society feels wrong. On one hand, sure, chronic theft isn't great for society, but is it really so bad if a man who needs so little shaves the fat off of society, taking a little bit of our excess that matters little to us but means the world to him? With that, I think I'll end this video with a quote from Knight. In one of his interviews, he was asked what he felt was the meaning of life. And to put it elegantly, Knight responded, "To get enough sleep." So with that, I hope you're enjoying your night and getting enough sleep. And don't you ever forget, it's always story time.